More than 1,700 people are buried behind this Maryland hospital, and for decades, many of them did not have names. They just had numbers. No biography or family stories, or no final sentence carved into stone, just a number in the ground. But the graves are not the most disturbing part. The real question is how they got there. Because Crownsville was not just an abandoned hospital, it was a segregated institution. It was built by its own patients, and one of the children who died there was connected to one of the most famous medical scandals in American history. By the end of this story, you'll understand why Crownsville is not haunted because of ghosts. It's haunted because of what Maryland tried to forget. The story begins in 1910. Maryland purchased hundreds of acres of farmland in Crownsville, just outside Annapolis. At first, that sounds peaceful, a farm, open fields, a quiet place away from the city. But this land was chosen for something much darker. It was chosen to create a separate psychiatric hospital for Black patients. And at the time, segregation touched almost every part of American life. Schools were segregated, and neighborhoods and public spaces were all segregated. And mental health care was segregated too. The hospital was originally created under a name that is shocking to hear now. It's called the Hospital for the Negro Insane. That name alone tells you what kind of world this place came from, but what happened next tells you even more. In 1911, the first patients arrived. There were 12 of them, and there was no finished hospital waiting for them. There were no wards or no treatment rooms or no medical campus. It was just farmland. And the first patients were housed in an existing farm building in the land. And then they were put to work. They helped build the hospital. The same people the state had classified as mentally ill were brought to the property and made part of the labor force that constructed the institution that would eventually confine thousands. Crownsville was not just built for patients, it was built by them. Remember that detail, because once you understand that, the rest of the story feels different. From the very beginning, Crownsville was not only about treatment, it was about control, and control is what allowed this place to keep growing. More patients arrived. More buildings went up. The campus expanded, and year after year, Crownsville became larger. But the question is this: was it growing because it was helping people, or was it growing because Maryland needed somewhere to put people it didn't want to see? That question follows this entire story, because as the hospital expanded, so did the problems. Diseases spread, overcrowding worsened, staffing struggled, funding lagged. Patients with different conditions were often housed together, and for many people inside, Crownsville became less like a place of healing and more like a place where life could simply stop moving. Imagine entering a hospital in your 20s. At first, maybe you think it's temporary, maybe your family thinks you'll come home soon, then months pass, then years, then a decade. The world outside changes, the cars, the music all change, people you know all get older, but you're still there, behind the same walls, looking out the same windows, waiting for someone to come back. For some patients, that was Crownsville. And the deeper you go into its history, the more one thing becomes clear. People did not always disappear all at once. Sometimes they disappeared slowly. When people talk about abandoned hospitals, they usually focus on the creepy parts, like the broken windows and the empty beds and the dark, decaying hallways and doors that are falling apart. But the scariest part of Crownsville is not the building. It is imagining daily life inside of it. By the 1940s and 50s, Crownsville was overcrowded and under-resourced. Wards filled up and dormitories overflowed. Rows of beds stretched across open rooms. Privacy was limited and freedom was limited. Patients were told when to wake up, when to eat, when to work, when to sleep. And for some, the hospital became their entire world. And when an institution becomes your whole world, every detail matters. The noise, the smell, the food, the boredom, and feeling of being watched, the feeling of being forgotten. That may be the most disturbing word in this whole story, forgotten. Because Crownsville was not hidden, it was not ancient history. It was just here, in Maryland. People drove nearby. Life continued around it, but inside, thousands of people were living in conditions most of the public never had to see. And eventually, the pressure inside the hospital erupted. By the 1950s, Crownsville had become impossible to ignore. There were reports of overcrowding, poor conditions, reports of patients were not receiving the care they needed, and inevitably there were riots. So think about that. A psychiatric hospital was supposed to be a place of care, but the pressure inside of Crownsville became so intense that people rebelled. Authorities responded with force, with tear gas and fire hoses inside that hospital. That image should stay with you, because it changes the way you understand this place. This was not just a creepy abandoned building. It was a state institution where vulnerable people had very little power. And when these people reached a breaking point, they were not treated like patients in crisis. They were treated like a threat to be contained. But that's still not the worst part, because while this outside world was slowly learning about the conditions inside of Crownsville, another question was beginning to surface. What exactly was being done to the people inside? In the 1940s, investigators and journalists began exposing conditions inside Maryland's mental institutions. One phrase became attached to this era: Maryland shame. This wasn't just Maryland's mistake or Maryland's problem. They called it shame, and that wording matters because it suggests that people were not only shocked by what was happening, they were embarrassed that it had been allowed to happen for so long. At Crownsville, the criticism included overcrowding, lack of resources, poor conditions, limited recreation, limited education, and concerns about patient treatment. And remember, Crownsville had begun as a segregated institution. It existed inside a system where Black patients were separated, underfunded, and often ignored. So when people ask how a cemetery of numbered graves could happen, this is part of the answer. It did not happen in one day. It happened through policy and neglect and silence, through a system that made certain people easier to disappear. And then the story turns to the treatments. Psychiatric treatments in the early and mid-20th century were very different from what we understand today. Doctors were searching for answers, some believed they were helping, but belief does not erase the harm. Patients in institutions like Crownsville lived through an era where mental health care could involve treatments that were invasive, painful, and sometimes permanently damaging. Hydrotherapy, where patients could be immersed in water for long periods. Some were even wrapped in wet sheets. There's insulin shock therapy, where doctors intentionally induced comas in hopes of treating mental illness. The risks were enormous. And then there was the lobotomy, one of the most infamous procedures in psychiatric history. Across the country, thousands of patients underwent surgeries that permanently changed brain functions. Some lost parts of their personality, some lost independence, and some never recovered. But the most disturbing part is not only the procedures, it's the power imbalance. The state and the doctors had power, and the institution had power, but the patients almost had none. When you're locked inside a system, how do you refuse? Who listens when you say no? Who believes you? And that question becomes even darker when the patient is a child, because one of those children who died at the Crownsville Hospital was named Elsie Lax. Most people have heard of the name Henrietta Lacks. Her cells became one of the most important tools in modern medicine, but far fewer people know about her daughter, Elsie Lax. Elsie was Henrietta's second child. She was sent to Crownsville when she was just 10 years old, and at 15, 5 years later, she died there. But for decades, her family didn't fully know what happened to her inside Crownsville, and that is where the story turns into something that feels almost impossible. Years later, Rebecca Sloot and Henrietta's daughter, Deborah, went searching for answers about Elsie. They went to Crownsville. They walked through the hospital, and they found a room labeled medical records. But when they looked inside, the room was completely empty. There were no files and no answers. There were nothing. For a moment, it looked like Elsie's story had disappeared with the rest of the records. But then they found someone who could help. His name was Paul Lurs, and he had worked at Crownsville for years. When Deborah told him about Elsie, he went to a storage cabinet. Because even though many of Crownsville's old medical records had reportedly been destroyed after being contaminated with asbestos, Lurs had saved some cloth-bound books filled with autopsy reports. And inside one of those books, there was a record for Elsie Lax. And attached to that record was a photograph. Elsie was standing against a wall with height measurements, and she was crying. Her head was being held in a place by a staff member. Imagine being Deborah Lax in that moment. You spent years wondering what happened to your sister, and the first real image you find is not Elsie being held with care, but Elsie restrained inside the institution where she died. The language in the record was cold and dehumanizing. It described Elsie with an outdated diagnosis that today feels cruel to even say: idiocy. And it described a child who had been suffering before her death. For months, Elsie had reportedly been forcing herself to vomit. That detail is horrifying because it makes her suffering impossible to ignore. This was not just a name in the file. It was a child in distress. And while Sloot, Deborah, and Lurs were reading through the report, someone came into the room and questioned why they were looking for records. Deborah had to prove she was Elsie's relative. She had to prove that she had the right to see what happened to her own sister. That detail says everything, because Elsie had already been taken from her family. Her story had already been buried in institutional files. And even decades later, the truth still had to be fought for. Historical accounts also suggest Elsie may have been part of neurological research involving epilepsy patients. One procedure involved removing fluid from around the brain and replacing it with air so doctors could see brain structures more clearly on x-rays. Patients could experience severe pain and headaches, nausea, vomiting. And by today's standards, that's horrifying to imagine a vulnerable child inside an institution being subjected to something like that without real consent. Elsie's story matters because she gives Crownsville a face. She was a child, and a sister, and a daughter. And once you understand what happened to Elsie, the cemetery behind Crownsville feels different, because she was not the only life that ended there. Not even close. One number kept growing, the number of people buried on the property. Behind Crownsville Hospital is a cemetery, and this is where the story becomes almost impossible to process. More than 1,700 people were buried there. Many markers did not even carry names. They had numbers. So just imagine that. You live an entire life, you have memories and fears, childhood, you have a family, and people loved you, you loved someone, but someone spent years wondering where you went. And after all of that, your final marker is not even your name. It's just a number. That is what makes Crownsville so haunting. It was the fact that real people were reduced to numbers in death after being controlled in life. And for decades, many Marylanders had no idea. I didn't even know about this. They drove past, they went to work, they went shopping, they went home, and nearby in the ground there were rows of people whose names had almost disappeared from history. This is the part of the story that should make you feel a bit angry, because forgetting someone is not always an accident. Sometimes forgetting is what happens when a system decides a person does not matter enough to remember. But Crownsville's story does not end there, because eventually someone walked into that cemetery and refused to accept the numbers. In 2001, historian Janice Hayes Williams visited the cemetery. She saw the numbered stones, rows of them, and she began asking the question that should have been asked decades earlier. Who are they? Not how many, but who. Because numbers are easy to ignore, names are not. A number can become a statistic. A name becomes a person. So Hayes Williams and others began searching through records, death certificates and archives and hospital documents, old forms, anything that could reconnect a number in the ground to a human life, one name at a time. And slowly the cemetery began to change. Not physically at first, but historically and spiritually, morally. People who had been buried anonymously began to reappear in the record. They had name, ages, hometowns, families, lives before Crownsville. And that changes everything. Because Crownsville is not ultimately a story about an abandoned hospital. It's a story about what happened when society decides some people are easier to hide than help. Today, Crownsville is being reimagined as Crownsville Hospital Memorial Park. The plan includes memorial spaces, trails, educational facilities, community uses, and places for reflection. It sounds hopeful, and it is, but it also comes with a warning, because if Crownsville becomes only a park, only a pretty place to walk, only another historic property with a sign out front, then part of the story gets buried again. This land does not need to be erased. It needs to be remembered correctly, because the people buried here deserve more than curiosity. They deserve more than ghost stories. They deserve more than people sneaking into abandoned buildings for a thrill. They deserve dignity and names, and they deserve to be remembered as human beings. At the beginning of this episode, I told you more than 1,700 people were buried behind Crownsville Hospital. Many were once marked by only numbers. Now you know how something like that can happen. Not through one evil moment, but through years of segregation and neglect and overcrowding and silence in a system that made vulnerable people disappear. So maybe the real horror of Crownsville is not that people say it's haunted. Maybe the real horror is that for decades, the people inside were treated like they were ghosts. And now, more than a century after the first patients arrived, Maryland is still trying to give them their names back. If you live in Maryland, you may have driven past Crownsville without knowing what was behind those buildings. But now you do. And once you know, this place becomes impossible to forget.